The call came just as I was stepping out of a meeting. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I saw my mother's name flashing on the screen, I hesitated. She never called me during work hours unless it was urgent. I answered, expecting the worst. Maybe something had happened to my father, or there was an emergency. But nothing could have prepared me for what she said. "We sold the apartment," she said, her voice unnervingly casual. I froze. "What?" "The apartment," she repeated, as if I had misheard. "We got a great offer. It's done." The world seemed to tilt for a second. My apartment. The place I had worked years to afford, the one thing that truly belonged to me. They had sold it, without telling me, without asking, without permission. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, my pulse hammering. "You had no right. That apartment is mine." A sigh. The kind of sigh parents give when they think their child is being difficult. We needed the money. It's still family property. Family property. That was the phrase they always used when they wanted control over something that was never theirs to begin with. I had saved for years, sacrificed nights out, taken extra shifts just to make that down payment. I had done it all on my own. And now, just like that, they had taken it away. I was already moving, my body acting on pure instinct. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I stormed toward my car, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. They thought they had one, that I would have no choice but to accept it. But they didn't know the truth. I had the real deed. The only deed that mattered. And they were about to learn just how big of a mistake they had made. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind replayed my mother's words over and over, each repetition sending a fresh wave of disbelief through me. They had sold my apartment. My apartment. As I drove toward my parents' house, my heart pounded in my chest, the betrayal sinking deeper with every mile. By the time I reached their house, my hands were shaking. I barely remembered parking before I was at their front door, banging so hard the sound echoed. The door swung open, and there stood my mother, her expression carefully composed, as if she had been expecting this confrontation. "You didn't have to come storming in like this," she said coolly. I pushed past her, stepping into the living room where my father sat on the couch, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Tell me this is a joke," I said, looking between them. "Tell me you didn't actually sell my apartment." My father exhaled sharply. "We already told you. It's done. The papers have been signed." I let out a bitter laugh. "Papers? What papers? You didn't have any authority to sell it. That apartment is in my name." "That's where you're wrong," my mother said, her voice steady. "The apartment was originally purchased under the family's name. We had access to the paperwork. It wasn't hard to forge my signature." I interrupted, my voice rising. "Because that's what you did, isn't it?" Silence. My mother glanced away, and my father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That was all the confirmation I needed. I took a step back, my chest heaving. "You committed fraud. Do you understand that? This isn't just some family disagreement. You stole from me." My mother's lips tightened. "You're being dramatic. We did what was best for the family. We needed the money. And you thought you could take my home to fix your mistakes?" My voice cracked, rage and hurt warring inside me. "You always do this. You act like everything I have belongs to you." My father leaned forward, his voice colder now. "We raised you. We supported you. And you think you did this all on your own? That apartment only exists because of us." I swallowed hard, the weight of their words pressing against me. This wasn't just about the apartment. This was about control, about them refusing to accept that I had built something for myself, separate from them. But they had miscalculated. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my email. "I have the real deed. The one with my name. The one filed directly with the housing authority." I turned the screen toward them. "Whatever papers you forged don't mean a thing." My mother's face paled. My father's expression darkened. "You're lying," he said, though his voice wavered. I shook my head. "No. And you know what that means. It means the buyer has nothing. No legal claim. It means this sale is worthless. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed my mother's face. I could see her mind racing, trying to piece together how this had slipped through their fingers. Then, something else hit me. Who did you sell it to? I demanded. My parents exchanged a glance. My stomach twisted. Who? A private investor, my father muttered. My breath caught. I had spent years hearing horror stories about people who bought properties in shady deals, only to turn around and demand payment, eviction, or worse. If they had sold my apartment to someone like that. I pulled up my banking app and scrolled to my mortgage records. The payments are still in my name, I said, almost to myself. Which means they didn't clear any debts. So what did you do with the money? Again, that look. That silent exchange. A sick feeling crept into my gut. You don't have it, do you? My father's jaw clenched. My mother averted her gaze. It all clicked. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had been desperate. Probably drowning in debt. And whatever deal they had made, it hadn't gone the way they expected. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. I'm going to fix this, I said. Not for you, for myself. I met their eyes. And when I do, I won't be coming back. My mother flinched. My father said nothing. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I had a home to take back. The cold evening air bit at my skin as I stormed back to my car. My hands shook. Not from the chill but from rage. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, a suffocating weight I couldn't shake. My own parents had stolen from me, and the worst part was that they didn't even seem to regret it. They had justified it to themselves, convinced that their need outweighed my right to what was mine. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated me. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled up the email from the housing authority again, staring at the official deed. My name, my legal ownership. Untouched, unchallenged. My parents had sold something they never had the right to sell. I took a deep breath and dialed my real estate lawyer, David Klein. He picked up on the second ring. David, it's me. I need your help. It's urgent. His voice was calm but alert. What's going on? My parents sold my apartment behind my back. Forged paperwork, tricked a buyer. But I have the real deed. There was a pause. Then a sharp inhale. That's fraud. Have you confronted them? Just did, I said through gritted teeth. They don't even have the money anymore. I don't know where it went. David sighed. This is bad. But if the real deed is in your name, then legally, the sale is invalid. The problem is getting the buyer to accept that without turning this into a full-blown legal battle. I leaned back against the headrest. I need to know who they sold it to. Send me everything you have, David said. If there's a paper trail, I'll find it. I ended the call and immediately forwarded every document I could find. Then, I started making calls of my own. Mortgage office. Property registry. The pieces had to be there somewhere. Hours passed in a blur of emails, phone calls, and unanswered questions. By the time David called back, exhaustion weighed on me, but I was too wired to rest. I found the buyer, David said, his tone grim. You're not going to like this. My heart pounded. Who? A man named Victor Langley. Private investor. Known for aggressive property takeovers. He doesn't buy places to live in. He buys them to flip, or worse, to trap owners in legal battles until they're forced to settle on his terms. I swallowed hard. So, he knows exactly what he's doing. Oh, he knows, David confirmed. And if he finds out your parents didn't have the right to sell, he might not just walk away. He might come after them for fraud. I should have felt vindicated. But instead, unease settled over me. Victor Langley wasn't just a problem for me. He was about to become my parents' worst nightmare. And as much as they had betrayed me, I wasn't sure I was ready to see them destroyed. A notification popped up on my screen. A message from an unknown number. We need to talk. I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. David, I said slowly. Victor just texted me. A pause. Then, do not meet him alone. The next evening, I sat in a sleek, dimly lit restaurant, my nerves taut as I waited. The moment Victor Langley stepped inside, I knew he was dangerous. He was tall, immaculately dressed, his expression unreadable. He moved with the confidence of someone who always got what he wanted. He slid into the seat across from me, studying me with a faint smirk. "You must be the real owner." I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch between us, waiting. He chuckled. "Your parents made quite the mess." I clenched my jaw. The sale was fraudulent. "You don't own my apartment." His smirk didn't falter. "Legally, maybe. But in business, paperwork is just a starting point. I've already invested time and resources into this deal. That means I expect compensation." I narrowed my eyes. "You expect me to pay you for something you never owned?" He shrugged. "Your parents agreed to the sale. They took my money. That makes them my problem. But here's the thing," he leaned forward slightly. "If you want this to go away quietly, you're going to need to make me an offer." Cold chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just about a legal dispute anymore. Victor Langley wasn't just a businessman, he was a predator. I force myself to stay calm. "And if I don't?" His smirk widened. "Then I take this to court. I drag your parents through a fraud case so deep they'll never crawl out. Or worse, I decide I still want the property, and I start making things difficult for you." I swallowed hard. He was testing me, waiting to see if I'd break. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. I leaned in, meeting his gaze head-on. "I have an alternative." His eyes flickered with curiosity. "I'm listening." I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table, the screen displaying an email draft. "I have a full report ready to go to the housing authority, the state attorney, and every real estate watchdog in the city. It outlines every fraudulent deal linked to your name, including this one." Victor's smirk faded. "You're right," I continued. "My parents made a mess. But if you push me, I'll make sure your name is attached to every single one of their mistakes." A long silence stretched between us. Then, Victor leaned back and chuckled. "You're smarter than I expected." I didn't respond. I just waited. Finally, he stood, adjusting his cuffs. "Fine. I'll walk away. But don't think this means you won." I watched as he turned and strode out of the restaurant, tension still gripping my body like a vice. The moment he was gone, I exhaled shakily. I had won this round. But I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Now, I had to deal with my parents. And this time, there would be no second chances. The moment I stepped into my parents' house, I could feel the tension thick in the air. They were waiting for me, their faces tight with anxiety. My father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles had turned white. I closed the door behind me and faced them. "It's done," I said. "Victor Langley is walking away." My mother let out a shaky breath, but my father's expression darkened. "What did you do?" I leveled my gaze at him. "I did what you couldn't. I stopped him from destroying all of us." For a moment there was silence. Then, my father scoffed. "You think this makes you the hero? You think you saved us?" He shook his head. "You have no idea what we were dealing with." My hands curled into fists. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why did you go behind my back and sell my apartment like I was some child who didn't deserve a say?" "We had no choice," my mother said, her voice breaking. "We owed people. People we couldn't afford to cross." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "And what did you do with the money? Because Victor sure wasn't happy about where it went." Neither of them spoke. I took a step closer. "Tell me the truth." My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. My father turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. The weight of their silence told me everything. "You lost it," I whispered. "Didn't you?" Still, they said nothing. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I spent years working for that apartment. I gave up everything to have something that was mine. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to keep going. And you just, what? Gambled it away. Fell into another bad deal. We thought we could fix it, my mother said quietly. We thought if we got one more chance. One more chance, I repeated, laughter bubbling up, sharp and bitter. That's all it ever is with you. One more chance, one more excuse, one more lie. My father's temper snapped. We did what we had to do for this family. I flinched, but I didn't back down. No. You did what you had to do for yourselves. And you used me to do it. The words hung in the air, undeniable, unforgivable. My father's breathing was heavy, his face red with frustration, but there was nothing left for him to say. My mother finally broke. Tears spilled down her face, her shoulders shaking. We never wanted to hurt you. I stared at her, at the mother who had always made me feel like I owed her my success. The father who had treated my independence as a betrayal. And I realized something. They were never going to change. I straightened, my voice steady now. I'm done. My mother's breath hitched. What do you mean? I mean, I'm done cleaning up your messes. I'm done letting you take from me and expecting me to forgive you. I met my father's cold gaze. This was the last time. A tear slipped down my mother's cheek. We're family. I shook my head. No. Family doesn't do this. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding. I had spent my whole life trying to make them proud, trying to be enough for them. But I finally understood, I was never supposed to be their savior. I was supposed to save myself. Without another word, I walked out, leaving them behind. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped out of my parents' house for the last time. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for days, maybe years, began to lift. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in, letting the silence settle around me. It felt different this time. Not empty, not lonely. Just peaceful. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel as I stared at my parents' house in the rearview mirror. This was supposed to be the place where I felt safe, where love wasn't conditional, where family meant something more than just obligation. But I had spent too long trying to hold on to an illusion. The truth was, my parents had made their choices, and now, I was finally making mine. I pulled away from the curb and drove straight to my apartment. The closer I got, the stronger my resolve became. This was my home. Mine. No one was going to take that from me again. When I arrived, the building was quiet, the city's hum a steady presence in the background. I stepped inside, running my fingers along the walls as I walked through the space. I had fought for this. Worked for this. No one had handed it to me, and no one would ever take it away again. I stood in the center of the living room, letting out a slow breath. The echoes of the past few days, my parents' betrayal, the confrontation with Victor Langley, the weight of everything I had lost, still lingered, but they no longer consumed me. I had won. Not just the apartment, but something more. I had won my freedom. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. My stomach tensed, but when I opened it, it was David, my lawyer. He held a thick folder in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. I figured you could use a drink, he said, stepping inside. I managed a small smile. You figured right. We sat at the kitchen counter as he flipped open the folder. I filed everything with the housing authority. The fraudulent sale is officially void. Victor's backing off, and your parents, he hesitated. Well, they're on their own now. I nodded, running a finger along the rim of my glass. They won't change. No, David agreed. They won't. I swallowed the burn of the whiskey, letting it settle. I always thought that if I was good enough, successful enough, they'd finally see me as my own person. But they never wanted that. David exhaled. Some people don't want to see you stand on your own. Because then they lose control. I turned to look at him. Then I guess I was never really free before. He lifted his glass. You are now. I clinked my glass against his, a quiet toast to the battle I had fought and won. But as I sat there, I realized something. This wasn't just about the apartment. It wasn't just about my parents. This was about me finally stepping into my own life, on my own terms. No more looking back. No more waiting for permission. This was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. The city lights stretched out before me as I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the world move on. It felt different now, brighter, clearer, as if I was finally seeing it without the weight of expectation pressing down on me. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect daughter, the responsible one, the fixer. I had convinced myself that if I did everything right, my parents would finally respect me, finally treat me as an equal. But respect wasn't something you earned from people who saw you as a resource rather than a person. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't waiting for them to apologize or make things right. I had taken my life back, and that was all that mattered. The past would always be there, woven into the fabric of who I was. But it didn't define me anymore. My phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, my mother's name. I stared at it for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the screen. Then, I let it ring. Some bridges were meant to burn. I walked away from the phone, from the past, from everything that had held me back. I had my home. I had my freedom. And that was all I needed.